September 1944. Lorraine, France. The fields were quiet under a heavy mist. Dew clung to the grass, muffling the sound of engines hidden beyond the hills. The morning smelled of wet earth, diesel, and tension. Somewhere out there, the Germans were coming. The men of Patton's Third Army were exhausted. They had fought their way across France, their tanks running low on fuel, their supply lines stretched thin, but they held the ground near Arracourt, unaware that one of Hitler's last armored hopes was about to strike. The German counterattack came not from strength, but desperation. The newly formed 5th Panzer Army, equipped with fresh Panther tanks, was ordered to cut through Lorraine and crush the U.S. 4th Armored Division before it could regroup. Hitler believed the fog and surprise would give his panzers an edge. But the Americans had something the Germans didn't: experience, communication, and leadership. Under General John S. Wood, and with battalion commanders like Creighton Abrams, the 4th Armored Division had spent months fighting mobile battles across France. They knew how to adapt, how to move, strike, and vanish before the enemy even knew where they were. The fog rolled thick that morning. Visibility dropped to less than 200 yards. German Panthers advanced through it like ghosts, powerful, silent, and blind. Each tank weighed nearly 50 tons, its 75mm high-velocity gun capable of killing a Sherman from over a mile away. But in that fog, firepower meant little. At 8 a.m., the first German formations moved toward the American positions. They expected chaos, retreat. Instead, they met calm precision. American crews using SCR-508A radios relayed coordinates in real time. Tank commanders positioned their Shermans behind ridges and hedgerows, engines idling. They listened, waited, and when the silhouettes appeared through the mist, they fired first. A Panther's armor could shrug off a Sherman's shell from the front, but from the side, from an ambush, it burned like paper. That morning, several German tanks erupted in flame before they even spotted their enemy. The fog helped both sides and blinded both, but the Americans talked through it. Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion moved like a hunting pack, shifting positions by radio, coordinating fire between platoons. The Germans, unable to communicate through the confusion, advanced blindly, their formation breaking apart in the gray haze. By noon, smoke lay thick over the fields of Arracourt. The Germans had lost dozens of Panthers, not to superior tanks, but to superior command. Abrams' Shermans darted in and out of cover, hitting fast, then fading before the Panthers could aim. Patton, watching the reports come in, realized his doctrine of aggressive defense was working. He had always believed mobility and initiative mattered more than armor thickness. At Arracourt, his theory was being proven, in fire and steel. German officers couldn't understand it. They had expected to roll over a scattered enemy. Instead, they found themselves ambushed at every turn. The American air power, though grounded early by fog, began to return by afternoon. The P-47 Thunderbolts dove through breaks in the clouds, turning German retreat into slaughter. By nightfall, more than 80 Panthers were destroyed or abandoned. The 4th Armored Division had lost fewer than 30 Shermans. And yet for the men in those tanks, victory didn't feel clean. They had watched friends die in burning steel, heard voices cut off mid-report, smelled cordite and gasoline mixing in the air. But they had held. The fog that Hitler believed would hide his panzers had instead blinded them. The coordination he thought impossible for Americans had turned his elite armor into targets. Arracourt was more than a tactical victory. It was proof. Proof that leadership, training, and communication could defeat even the most powerful machines the Reich could build. As night fell, Patton's Third Army stood firm. The German counteroffensive had failed. The Panthers lay silent across the fields, smoke rising from their hulks. The Shermans, battered, scorched, and low on ammo, idled quietly, their crews too tired to cheer. In the distance, the sky was cleared. The sound of thunder faded, replaced by the low rumble of tanks repositioning for the next day's fight. The Battle of Arracourt was not over yet, but its outcome was already sealed, because in Lorraine, the myth of the invincible German Panzer died, buried beneath the fog, the fields, and the iron will of Patton's Third Army. The next morning, September 20th, 1944. The fog returned, thicker than before. It rolled over the Lorraine countryside like a shroud, muffling the clatter of engines and the voices of men tightening their grips on cold steel. The world was gray, silent, and deadly. Inside the American lines, tension was suffocating. Creighton Abrams and his men of the 37th Tank Battalion had spent the night repositioning, digging in behind hedgerows and villages that barely existed on the maps. The ground was soft, the air cold. Radios crackled softly, constant, calm, disciplined. The Germans were coming again. At dawn, the first reports came through from the outposts. Movement, heavy armor north of Bézange-la-Petite. Then more, engines to the east, near Lezay. The 5th Panzer Army was throwing everything it had left. They were confident. After all, they had the numbers. Nearly 100 Panthers and supporting Mark IVs, against barely 60 Shermans and a handful of tank destroyers. On paper, it was suicide for the Americans. But the battlefield doesn't read paper. It listens. It adapts. Abrams understood that. He moved his tanks not to hold the line, but to bend it, to lure the Germans into the low ground where fog and terrain would betray them. When the first Panthers crested the ridges, their silhouettes appeared like shadows through milk. American gunners waited until the shapes solidified, black crosses faint against the mist. Then they fired. Shells tore into steel. Panthers burned. The valley erupted in flashes of light and sound, the fog glowing orange with each hit. But still, they kept coming. The Germans believed they were overwhelming an isolated outpost. Instead, they were driving straight into a coordinated trap, a network of hidden Shermans, tank destroyers, and artillery observers, all connected by radio, invisible but everywhere at once. In that chaos, communication became the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. American commanders spoke in short bursts, calm, precise, practiced. 2 Panthers, left flank, fire and shift. Airstrike inbound, hold your line, reload, move, engage. On the German side, confusion reigned. Fog disrupted visual signals. Radios failed to link platoons. Officers shouted through open hatches, but their voices vanished into the mist. Entire units fired blindly, unsure if they were hitting enemy or friend. And above them, faintly, came a new sound, the growl of engines cutting through clouds. The fog was breaking. From the west, P-47 Thunderbolts descended, streaking low through the haze. They didn't need clear skies, only coordinates. American forward observers guided them in, radioing live adjustments as each bomb whistled down. The ground shook. Panthers exploded where they stood. Columns shattered, tracks twisted. The counterattack disintegrated under the combined force of steel, air, and communication. By mid-afternoon, the battle had turned. Abrams' Shermans surged forward, closing in on isolated German tanks. It wasn't about brute strength anymore. It was precision, speed, and teamwork. 1 Panther, cornered near a farmhouse, fired wildly, missing every shot. 3 Shermans closed from different angles, firing in unison. When the smoke cleared, all that was left was wreckage and silence. By sunset, the Germans were retreating. Their so-called elite divisions, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, were broken, scattered, and bleeding. The Panthers that had survived were out of fuel, their commanders out of hope. The battlefield was littered with wrecks, smoking hulks, twisted metal, and blackened fields that smelled of oil and death. And through it all, the American tanks kept moving. That was Patton's doctrine: never stop, keep pressure on the enemy, keep momentum, don't let them breathe. In Lorraine, that philosophy came alive. While the Germans hesitated, checked maps, waited for orders, the Third Army improvised, adapted, attacked. And though the Panthers were deadlier on paper, it was the Shermans, lighter, faster, coordinated, that owned the battlefield. By nightfall, the fog had lifted for good. The men of the 4th Armored Division could finally see the ground they'd been fighting for, a landscape of wrecked German armor stretching to the horizon. In just 2 days, they had destroyed or disabled over 250 enemy vehicles, the cost fewer than 50 of their own. But the victory didn't feel like triumph, it felt like survival. Creighton Abrams, his tank still warm from combat, stood by the smoking fields that evening. He said quietly to one of his officers, "They sent their best, and this is what's left of them." Arracourt had been more than a clash of machines. It was a test of minds, of leadership, of discipline, of will. And the Americans had proven that wars are not won by fear or fury, but by the ability to think faster, move smarter, and trust the man beside you. The fog had cleared, but its lesson remained. In modern war, knowledge travels faster than armor, and those who can hear, adapt, and act win. The sun rose weak and cold over Lorraine on September 21st. The fields were scarred now, craters where wheat once grew, twisted hulks where tanks once stood. Smoke still drifted across the valley, rising from Panthers burned down to their frames. For the men of the 37th Tank Battalion, there was no celebration. The smell of gasoline and scorched paint clung to everything. The ground was black with oil. They had survived another day, but the enemy wasn't finished. The 5th Panzer Army, desperate to reclaim the initiative, regrouped overnight. Reinforcements arrived, more Panthers, more Mark IVs, some drawn straight from the factory floor. Their commanders, believing the Americans had been weakened, planned one last push toward Arracourt. Patton, meanwhile, had already ordered Abrams to counterattack. He didn't believe in waiting. "Keep punching even when they fall," he'd said. It wasn't arrogance, it was instinct. He knew the Germans could no longer absorb the hits they once could. At first light, Abrams moved. His Shermans rolled forward in tight formation, engines rumbling through the mist. They advanced toward Lezy and Juvilais, villages now reduced to rubble. The men were running on nerves, cigarettes, and adrenaline. They'd slept barely an hour. The enemy struck first. From the ridges ahead, German shells screamed down, smashing into the fields around the Lyd tanks. One Sherman took a direct hit. The turret blown clear off. Another caught fire, its crew scrambling out before ammunition cooked off inside. But Abrams didn't flinch. He'd learned something the Germans hadn't, that mobility was armor in itself. He ordered his battalions to fan out, flank the ridge, and hit the Panthers from both sides. What followed was chaos. Controlled chaos. The radio nets crackled nonstop. "Fire mission at grid 7-3. 3 Panthers in the orchard. Left, left. P-47s inbound from west. Hold your fire." Within minutes, air support screamed overhead. Thunderbolts dove through breaks in the clouds, their rockets streaking toward German armor. Each strike lit up the valley like a storm. The Germans tried to retreat into the fog again, but this time there was no escape. Their radio coordination was failing. Their fuel trucks had been bombed the day before. Panthers were running dry. Mid-battle, their crews abandoning them under fire. Abrams pressed harder. He maneuvered his Shermans around the flanks, taking the fight right into the German lines. His tanks moved in pairs, one drawing fire, the other striking. It wasn't textbook tactics, it was experience. In the chaos, one Panther managed to get a clean shot on Abrams' own tank. The shell ripped through the side skirt, but failed to penetrate. His crew, shaken, swung the turret and fired back, point blank. The Panther vanished in a flash. "Keep moving," Abrams shouted over the radio. "Don't give them a target." By afternoon, the fog lifted once again, revealing the full extent of the destruction. The valley floor was littered with wrecks, blackened shells of Panthers, smoke curling from open hatches. The 4th Armored Division pushed forward another 3 miles, clearing Juvilliers and Bézange-la-Petite entirely. What had begun as a desperate defense had become a relentless advance. Across the front, German discipline began to unravel. Panzer brigades retreated without orders. Infantry scattered into the woods. Communications broke down completely. Hitler, furious, demanded explanations. His generals blamed the fog, the terrain, the Americans' cowardly use of air power, but in truth, they had been beaten by something they didn't understand: speed, coordination, and initiative. At Arracourt, the Germans brought the best tanks in the world. The Americans brought the best teamwork, and that made all the difference. By September 25th, the counteroffensive was over. Out of nearly 250 German tanks committed, more than 200 were destroyed or captured. The Americans, against all odds, had shattered an entire Panzer army, with Shermans that were outgunned, out-armored, and outnumbered. When the smoke finally cleared, the men of the Third Army stood victorious, but at a terrible cost. The battlefield was quiet again, except for the hiss of burning wreckage and the occasional crack of ammunition cooking off in the heat. General Patton visited the front days later. He stepped down from his jeep, surveyed the horizon, and simply said, "That's what happens when you fight men who know how to think." He was right. Arracourt wasn't won by brute strength. It was won by intelligence, by leaders who understood that war is not about the weapon, but the will behind it. Creighton Abrams would later say that Arracourt proved a truth he'd carry for the rest of his life. You can give a good man a bad tank and he'll still win. But give a bad man the best tank and he'll still lose. The Battle of Arracourt broke more than just a Panzer army. It broke the illusion of German invincibility in the West. From that moment on, Hitler's forces would never again launch a successful armored offensive on the Western Front. The fog lifted, the myth burned, and in its place stood the calm, relentless precision of Patton's Third Army, a force that moved like lightning and struck like thunder. When the guns finally fell silent over Lorraine, the scale of what had happened came into focus. The Battle of Arracourt wasn't just another clash in the long march to Germany. It was a turning point, the kind that defined the rest of the war. Across the fields, black smoke still curled from the carcasses of Panthers. Their turrets lay blown open like peeled cans, tracks torn from the hulls, the smell of fuel thick in the autumn air. The fog that had once been an ally to both sides now drifted lazily over the ruins, indifferent to who had won or lost. For Patton's Third Army, the victory was absolute. The Germans had thrown their best, 2 entire Panzer brigades, armed with the most feared tanks in Europe, and lost nearly all of them. The Americans had proven once and for all that war was no longer about who had the heaviest armor or the longest gun. It was about who could adapt faster. Patton understood that immediately. He visited the 4th Armored Division days after the battle, his boots crunching over the shattered glass of tank periscopes and the spent brass that covered the ground. Soldiers stood quietly as he walked past. He didn't shout. He didn't boast. He simply looked at the wrecked Panthers, nodded once, and said to Abrams, "That's how you fight a war." What he meant wasn't about firepower. It was about philosophy. Patton had built his doctrine around mobility, initiative, and relentless attack. To him, tanks weren't fortresses. They were fists. You hit fast, you hit hard, and you never waited for the enemy to finish thinking. At Arracourt, that philosophy became reality. The German command had believed that quality would outweigh quantity, that their engineering could save them, but their strength had become their weakness. The Panthers were powerful, yes, but they were heavy, slow, and blind in the fog. The Shermans, smaller and lighter, were everywhere at once. They communicated, they coordinated, and they killed efficiently. The secret weapon wasn't armor, it was organization. Each American tank was part of a living network, radios linking platoons, artillery, and air support into one fluid machine. When one tank went down, another shifted into its place. When the Germans hesitated, the Americans already had new orders. It was the beginning of what modern soldiers would call real-time warfare. Speed, communication, and precision overpowering brute force. German survivors later wrote in disbelief about what they had faced. The Americans were always where we didn't expect them, one Panther gunner recalled. They had fewer tanks, but they fought as if they were one. In the weeks that followed, the 5th Panzer Army ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The German High Command, desperate and out of fuel, had nothing left to replace its losses. Hitler, enraged, blamed his generals. But the truth was simpler. Germany had lost the last tool that once gave it an edge: time. The Americans were now faster in every sense. Faster to build, faster to move, faster to learn. Patton's Third Army pushed eastward relentlessly, crossing rivers and towns still scarred by war. Arracourt was just one battle, but it had revealed something profound, that the balance of the war had shifted permanently. The myth of the invincible Panzer had died in those foggy French fields, and with it the fear that had haunted Allied tank crews since 1940 began to fade. When reports reached Washington, Army planners studied every detail of the engagement. They saw what Abrams and his men had done, how coordination, not superiority, had carried the day. It became a blueprint for future warfare. Creighton Abrams, who had led his battalion through the thickest fighting, earned his reputation that week. He'd later command forces in Korea and Vietnam, and eventually the entire U.S. Army. But when asked in his final years which battle he remembered most, he said only Arracourt, because that's where we proved what kind of soldiers we were. Years later, veterans would return to Lorraine. They'd walk the same ridges now covered with grass and silence. Some found the rusting hulks of old tanks half buried in the soil. Others just stood quietly, listening to the wind, remembering the fog, the noise, the smell of cordite. Arracourt was not the biggest battle of World War II, but it was one of the purest. A contest of skill over strength, mind over machine. And in that contest, it was the Americans who showed the world that modern war belonged to those who could think, move, and trust faster than the enemy could react. As Patton himself wrote afterward, "Courage is fear holding on a minute longer. At Arracourt, our boys held on just long enough to win the war." The fields of Lorraine grew quiet again, the echoes of battle fading into history. But under that soil, scattered across the ridges and valleys, lie the remains of the moment when the tide truly turned. When the fog lifted, and the men of Patton's Third Army proved that no machine, no myth, no army could stand against those who refused to stop moving forward.